Several people have mailed me recently, sharing that they're questioning their own religious beliefs. Reading their different stories, I'm prompted to share my own transition to atheism with them, and whoever else is interested, taking into account both the emotional and the cognitive components of that switch. So here are 2 videos, each addressing one of those aspects, and using psychological models as frameworks to contextualize the psychological events involved. In this video, I'm using a 7-stage model of psychological transition put forward by Sugarman in her book Lifespan Development to explore the emotional side of my transition from Christian to atheist. But first, a word about an event that marked the beginning of my transition to atheism. I was in a religious education class at my non-religious school. We just swapped teachers. The first teacher was very religious. He was later discovered taking pictures of some schoolboys naked around his house, but let's don't dwell on that, shall we? His replacement was a cool customer. I'd say almost military in his demeanour, and indeed in his safari jackets. We had a few template generic lessons, nothing mind-blowing, just learning words like Talmud and Brahmin. Then a lesson where the teacher, let's call him Mr. Elliot, well, that was his name, showed a science video which contradicted bits of the Bible, particularly Genesis. For homework he asked us to write an essay about our thoughts. Well, I went home and wrote the most pompous little piece of dogma you could imagine. No arguments against the video at all, just dismissing it out of hand, and finishing off proudly with, "I am a Christian. My views will never change." Well, Mr. Elliot marked it, I got it back, and saw he'd commented, "Yes, you've written what your beliefs are, but are you able to say why you believe them?" That was all he'd written, and I wanted him wiped from the face of the planet. I think this would be a good point to introduce the model of psychological transition. We start with stage 1, immobilisation. When I first read Mr. Elliot's comment, I just felt total disorientation. To me, age 12, God in the Christian form I'd been indoctrinated with was just reality. I'd never questioned it. Now, for the first time, I was being asked for my reasons, and I didn't have a clue. All I came up with in my head was, it's true because it just is. And even I recognised how lame that sounded. I felt exposed. I felt caught out and made a fool of. Not by the people who'd indoctrinated me, no, by Mr. Elliot. Within days, I developed such a hatred and detestation for Mr. Elliot, it was untrue. I'd just watch him stand there in the background during assemblies and find myself mentally seething. Who the hell do you think you are? I was convinced he was laughing at me, sneering at me and my beliefs, which I should say he never did. That was total projection on my part. But eventually I moved into minimisation, alleviating some of my stress with a bit of rationalising. I rationalised that all the adults I knew were Christian, so Christianity was bound to be correct. I was comforted by the idea I was part of the majority. It's funny, that was probably the last time I ever felt part of a majority. Anyway, I told myself I'd simply get the answers from them. Unfortunately, when I asked, I discovered my fellow Christians couldn't come up with anything better than I had, which threw me back to stage 1. And I hovered around these stages for some time. Well, that's what happens. You move forward, you slip back. I did everything I could think of to try and find ways back to my beliefs. Reading the Bible was one of my more counterproductive strategies, because it only opened up a whole world of new contradictions I'd not even thought of. Eventually, feeling quite drained, I slumped into stage 3. I began to recognise that the situation probably wasn't going to be rescued. Outwardly, I was living the same life, going to church. I guess I still wanted to hang on to it, but it all felt totally hollow, mechanical, and so did I. Gradually, I slipped into stage 4. I finally acknowledged that there was no substantial foundation for the beliefs I'd been indoctrinated with. I felt I'd been made to say and do the most ridiculous things in the name of that belief. I'd been made to experience the most horrendous fantasies of eternal torture, the most horrendous emotions of guilt, fear, shame, over absolutely nothing. The scale of it was very hard to accept. But finally, I had accepted it. I began to look around at different belief systems that might fill the emptiness left behind. I looked at different religions, at the occult, but they all had the same problems. I was in limbo, with no sense of direction or identity, and I began to question what identity actually meant. I started considering my options, testing out new behaviours. First off, announcing at age 14 that I didn't believe in God and was leaving the church, which immediately sparked a welter of scorn, contempt, threats, guilt trips, all manner of judgments. It was a real eye-opener. So next I had to develop new strategies to cope with that bullying. I think for a while I felt so alienated, I just blanked it out. I didn't recognise these people anymore. But as it continued, I began to answer back and pull apart the comments and arguments that were coming my way. I toughened up. I knew that I was doing nothing wrong in thinking for myself, and actually, I just wasn't going to take any more punishment for that. Christian teachers at school who I'd previously been friendly with began to exert their own quasi-parental disapproval. So, socially, I had learned to cut them absolutely dead. Kept things strictly academic. Shutting people out like that was quite isolating, but if it was a choice between isolation or being with people who didn't want me to think, there was no choice. One of life's rules: people who don't want you to think are never your friend. Anyway, this part of the transition became substantially about building boundaries. I'd had very few, if any, boundaries up to that point, which is probably why so many people felt so relaxed about walking all over me. They never felt they were stepping over the line because there was no line. But now I was drawing that line and sticking to it hard. And gradually, relationships shifted back, albeit grudgingly, into some semblance of respect. I'd been handed the meaning of my life as a child. I now had to find my own meaning. But I quickly discovered that life without religion wasn't the barren land I'd been told it would be. I found meaning in searching out the truth of things, in scientific inquiry, in argument against poor logic and reasoning, particularly supernatural dogmas. I found meaning in psychological exploration, in addressing the distortions that are sometimes forced on us in life, and finding ways to counteract them. My morality, if anything, deepened. I was doing things now, not because I'd been instructed or coerced, but because I'd considered the underlying principles on a human level. Whatever old meaning I'd lost was more than replaced by the new meaning I found. Finally, the transition was resolved. I was at ease with myself. The issues that came up during the transition no longer dominated my life, and I moved on. It'll be plain to those who've listened that my transition to atheism wasn't some empty rebellion or a descent into self-indulgent immorality. It wasn't someone coming along and corrupting my young brain with blasphemous ideas. It was a child actively struggling to hold on to his religious illusions, but eventually acknowledging that there was absolutely no foundation to believe what he'd been told. I've had many great teachers in my life. Teachers I've laughed and joked around with, teachers I've confided in, teachers I've had crushes on. I never had much to do with Mr. Elliot, but I'll always be grateful to him for challenging me with that simple and actually very respectful comment, considering the tumescence of my essay's pomposity. I think of that comment as the surgical knife in the caesarean section of my intellectual life. Some blood and guts along the way, birth pains, sure, but finally freedom from the confinement that felt so snug and protective that I didn't realise how utterly immobilising and stultifying it actually was. To anyone watching this who finds themselves in any of the stages of transition described here, my very best wishes. You're on your own journey. It won't be the same as mine, but maybe there'll be some parallels. Now, there will undoubtedly be some people who see this video and try and distort the personal story I've shared into a fantasy more consistent with the prejudices they hold against atheists. And in the accompanying video, Atheism as Congruence, I'll explore how that kind of distortion can come about.